Chapter 2. You're lucky I tolerate all these interruptions. Tuadon Apollock had been making loops between his desk and the balcony, occasionally stopping at his desk to shuffle parchment or check his communicatory globe to see if any activity had come in. Running a hand through his short white hair, Tuadon resumed his pacing back towards the balcony. Taking a deep breath, Tuadon attempted to still his mind, consciously slowing his nervous pace to appear stoic. He stopped at the balcony for a moment and rested his slender arms against the railing, taking the city in. The eastern half of the Harmony district sprawled outward before him, buffeted by the western half of the advancement. His guild, the Athens Guild, had its offices in the World Building that was home to most of the city's other creative and media firms. In his grandfather's time, the Advancement District would have been called the Ethereal District. It was true most of the city's ethereal population still anchored themselves to manifestation points in the Advancement District, but the old name was deemed inappropriate. The name was a relic from a time when Okasela was a more divided city. Currently, Okasela is lauded as the place where the races came together to endure the great entropy of 400 years ago. But the initial growing pains were not pleasant for many involved, a subject often glossed over in history books on the subject. The city in the centuries following the great entropy welcomed beings of all forms, but they did not enjoy equal access to society. Come again, Scully? We will discuss the great entropy later, just not now. Initially, the humans and elves had been a top caste, with mixed-race sapiens and most varieties of physical fae. The unofficial middle caste were ethereals, spirits, celestials, and warm-blooded beast races. Everyone else had to fit into the bottom caste. Demons, constructs, both magical and technological, all other beast races, liches, undead, and all those extra universal transplants not so easily fit into a segmentation. Members of this bottom caste were welcome to live in the city, but had the least power and were the most marginalized. While the mechs were seen as members of the bottom caste, they often did not receive similar mistreatment to their fellow caste members, possibly due to their instrumental influence in the founding of Okasela. The mechs existed in a substrate of their own, mostly regarded with respect, but not given the full citizenship benefits enjoyed by members of the top caste. Well, I don't know where I would have stood, Scully. I want to give you the excuse I was still napping, but I can't help but feel some of my views are shaped by all the thoughts and feelings of others I'm experiencing. So, if I woke up back then, would I see it all through the same lens? I don't know. Oh, you don't have to apologize for interrupting me, not for that. That was a good question. It's just your little contrarian remarks that irk me. Now, where were we? That little history sidebar was so we can talk about the thing on Tuadon's mind. Tuadon. Yes, I'm excited to see him as well, Scully. Let's shift our focus a bit to present-day Okasela proper, past the windy spires. Second left after... Yes. No, don't look in the window at that guy changing. That's rude. There, that balcony. The middle-aged elf rested his arms against the ivory balcony outside his modern office, continuing to take in the bustling metropolis below him, his mind thrumming. Though currently alone, he felt the weight of multiple worlds on his slender shoulders. Nowadays, the Okasela whose skyline Tuadon was surveying tried to run itself on the idea that the nature of your being was irrelevant. All are equal. All sentients were endowed with the same inherent rights. It was a time to be judged for who, not what you were. To many, Tuadon included, this was not rhetoric. Tuadon believed it with all his heart. He did his best to live by this ideal, but worried he didn't always get it right. Tuadon was not one to pretend that the problems of division and oppression that existed in other places and older times were all gone. Nor did he pretend they were not in Arcosella. He did not delude himself that any one being could be free enough from bias to even know all the problems that even existed. He was concerned that, to many, the virtues of Arcosella were becoming a series of tick boxes on a checklist where declarations were more important than actions or effects. These situations were complex and could only be dealt with by many beings having many conversations, with room for debate and nuance and far more listening than anyone was doing now. It was one of these less-than-perfect aspects of Arcosella's past that was the crux of Tuadon's current vexation. This, as well as how exactly to approach the conversation he was about to have with his interviewer, which had set him pacing to begin with. Tuadon needed to discuss the various controversies around the upcoming new iteration of Earth Game. He was supposed to be the chief creative author, but tonight he would serve as a spokesperson for the entirety of the Athens Guild and the Earth Game project. In the far corner of his mind, Tuadon felt the gentle trill of his reception enchantment from his desk globe, notifying him that his guests had arrived and were approaching his office. Taking another deep breath, Tuadon straightened his posture as he recanted his thoughts to the upcoming interview. Journalist Salman Ann entered the chamber, his assistant Thomas in tow. Scanning the elegant yet sparsely decorated office, he noticed Tuadon standing in front of the adjoining balcony. Gesturing Thomas to begin preparations for the interview, Salman approached Tuadon from behind. "Yes, Scully, I know it just happened. But I need to watch it and take it in for a minute before I tell you. I need to consider and process." Salman cleared his throat to announce his presence. "Tuadon, I assume first names are good? Thank you for graciously receiving us today. I have a few questions before we begin." Tuadon turned to face him, and Salman clocked a hint of surprise in Tuadon's slate-blue eyes. "Sorry for the boldness," said the human, forcing old cultural niceties with a slight bow. "But I need to know if there are any illusion spells presently cast." Tuadon reflexively flinched at any hint of subservience in Salman's tone, though Tuadon was incorrectly reading what Salman meant only as a social nicety. Now facing the human reporter, Tuadon nodded respectfully in response and asked, "On me, or on the premises?" Seemingly unbothered or oblivious, Salman continued, "Either. I need to know about any at all. My assistant, that's him over there, Thomas." Salman motioned to the human, who paused rearranging 2 chairs in the office area at the sound of his name to offer a curt bow to Tuadon. "He will be using a mnemonic encoding spell rather than psionics for the broadcast. And this interview is going to be seen by at least 20,000 people between mirror viewers and immersion trance. Not counting whoever sees it non-synchronously on demand." "Ah," said Tuadon, happy to busy himself with something other than his anxiety. "So you need to flatten any illusions into the encoding spell? You know a little bit about modern journalism, huh?" asked Salman, visibly surprised. "I've broadcast from a few events," Tuadon said, a forced smile tugging at his lips. Salman began pacing the perimeter of the room with a small piece of hex glass to help him identify any global enchantments. "Anyone with a strong enough anti-illusory hex is going to see through the illusion spell. But if we know about them, we can flatten them into the encoding spell. So, how many—" "None, actually," said Tuadon. "Really?" Salman sounded incredulous and straightened his posture in response, placing the hex glass back into his shirt pocket. "See, that's a shirt with good pocket design." Salman continued walking the perimeter of the room, now just observing its contents. "Is it safe to keep the 5-eye metascrolls here with more mundane security?" Tuadon stifled a laugh. "We don't keep the scrolls with the new content here," Tuadon continued. We have illusion and security spells at the main hall, where we work on the game. But not here. Here we just talk about the broader aspects of our plans. Though it's mostly where I come to work on my own."
"Very good,"
said Salmon, finally finishing his circuit.
"Then my assistant only needs to encode my illusion spell."
"I keep one to hide a scar I have." Salmon tapped his seemingly unblemished right cheek. Tuadon remained silent, but the look on Salmon's face betrayed the fact that he expected a follow-up question. Salmon did not wait.
"Aren't you going to ask me why I keep an illusion spell over a scar, rather than just either heal it or show it without shame?"
Tuadon moved his eyes left to right, momentarily confused. "You can tell me if you like," Tuadon said, filterless due to confusion. "But it seems to me a very conscious act, so I would presume you have a good reason." Salmon's quick nod indicated he considered that portion of the conversation over.
"Well, we will be ready in about a third of a day shard for you,"
said Salmon, about to walk away. Tuadon tilted his head slightly, a bit surprised Salmon chose the archaic third of a day shard instead of just a third shard. Before he exited, Salmon turned back.
"What is that in Earth time?"
Now Tuadon understood. Salmon was testing him. Taking a moment to consider, Tuadon responded, "If we pretend that an Earth day and ours are equal length, that would be about 15 to 20 minutes. Salmon walked over to inspect Thomas's work and help adjust the projection crystal, while Thomas made final adjustments to the makeshift set.
"I don't really play, you know,"
said Salmon as he continued to adjust a few dials.
"But how did your writers decide Earth humans came up with a time-telling system without a sun?"
"They have a sun," said Tuadon as he joined Salmon beside the projection equipment. Tuadon, being a bit of a projection junkie himself, always loved checking out other people's setups. Salmon exchanged a thumbs up with Thomas and moved away from the crystal controls.
"How is their sun supposed to work with no magic?"
asked Salmon. "Well," Tuadon paused for a moment before responding. "There's no completely canonical world building for how the metaphysics or physics of Earth work. But there are in-game books where our players can read what Earth scientists think." Tuadon walked over to his desk and leaned against the edge, gesturing with an open hand for emphasis. "We use the unreliable narrator effect. The only thing we say is that even if there is magic in the universe of the game, the residents of Earth will never know about it." Salmon absently stroked his neatly trimmed salt and pepper goatee. "That's the whole point, right?
"A role-playing game in an imaginary world without magic?"
asked Salmon. Tuadon lowered his head to stifle a chuckle. "Yes." Pushing off from the desk's edge, he crossed the room to Salmon again, adjusting the thick black frames of his enhancement lenses. The tall elf paused a few feet before the shorter human, holding his long arms across his chest casually. "Anyway, most of the stars in their universe, at least the Earth residents believe, run through a process called nuclear fusion." Salmon furrowed his dark eyebrows.
"And this process is?"
Salmon tilted his head upward, watching Tuadon with a quiet intensity. Tuadon caught Salmon's gaze and stared for a moment into the human's brown eyes, slightly speckled with hints of green. He could feel the previously casual conversation moving into more direct tone, one that occurs entirely by causal laws. Tuadon felt slightly caught off guard by the journalist's formidable persona, but pushed himself not to outwardly show it. Pausing to carefully select his words, Tuadon continued. "If you want more information than that, you need to ask one of my lore masters." The elf motioned toward the office doors into the main hall beyond. "They write whole fictional treatises on the supposed natural laws of Earth's universe." Tuadon adjusted his posture into a more centered, confident stance. He wasn't sure of the purpose behind Salmon's building interrogation. but found it a welcome change from the typical dry interviewers sent to him by the larger metamedia outlets. Tuadon may not know every individual iota of the official lore, but he knew just enough to convince Selman he cared. Selman noted the change in Tuadon's demeanor and smiled.
So don't you guys ever have chats about what is actually canon?
Asked Salman. Much as Tuadon hated dry interviewers, Salman equally despised interviewees with paper-thin pretenses. Tuadon nodded thoughtfully. History, mostly, who won what war and all that. But no, we never strictly canonize the universal laws. Due to the sheer amount of effort we would have to pour into every minute detail. Though I'd say most of the writers and fans are convinced it's entirely causal. But technically, we only tell you what Tuadon stopped himself, glancing towards Salman reproachfully. Earth residents believe. In a moment of sheer social panic, Tuadon realized he had been throwing the word human around carelessly, and reflexively watched Salman for a response. Salman's features softened, realizing he was starting to break through Tuadon's carefully constructed shell.
You know, I call them Earth humans, the characters in your game.
The journalist smiled, tapping his chest for emphasis. Me, a human? I am not offended by it.
I don't necessarily see them as a one-to-one proxy for real humans,
Salman said in a reassuring tone. Tuadon narrowed his eyes slightly, the movement activating his lenses and bringing Salman's darker features into clearer view. Tuadon was surprised by Salman's reaction, but continued cautiously, waiting for an ambush. A moment passed, and Tuadon let himself sigh in relief. I understand why it could be offensive, though. Tuadon deactivated his lenses with a gentle tap alongside the frame and continued. Let's face it, the people who invented this game set out to create a fantasy world with no magic and one race decades ago in less enlightened times. We only ever see the world of Earth, even if there are other inhabited spheres in their universe. When the elves needed a race to occupy their magicless, fictional world, they chose humans. They could have invented a fantasy race or used elves, but they used humans.
You said the elves, but your father was the main guy that came up with the first iteration, right?
Asked Salman, his face remaining neutral. Tuadon studied Salman's face for an emotional response, but found only Salman's trademark poché face. The elf Salman referred to didn't feel much like a father to Tuadon, but he forced himself to not show that feeling outwardly. Yes, he was, and I don't know. Tuadon opened his arms for emphasis. As an elf, I realize that my perspective is limited. But there are two ways of looking at it. 2 generations back, no elves were authoring stories with human protagonists.
Sure,
said Salman, folding his thicker, muscle-toned arms behind his back and stepping alongside Tuadon. Turning his head slightly, he studied the light elf's pale, sharp features. Lowering his voice slightly, he continued.
But a lot of elves back then actually believed the stereotype that humans were less adept magic users than elves. So when they needed a race to live on their magicless world in their game, they picked humans. They made them very warlike in the old iterations, I've heard. Almost all brutes.
Clearly, this man who knew nothing about Earth Game had done some research. Or more likely, had it done for him and summarized by Thomas. Tuadon turned to face Salman wholly. He wasn't used to such physically involved conversations, which seemed to be the exact reason why Salman was doing this. He took a beat to study Salman. Tuadon was taller than him, yes, but the human had broad shoulders, indicating physical exertion was not something he was entirely unaccustomed to. Salman was a bit rounder around the abdomen, but the size did not appear to inhibit the human's very direct motions. Stiffening his back into a more upright posture, Tuadon breathed more confidence into himself. That is correct. But we've strived to update this for the new iteration. It's set in the 21st century of their time. And, like the real world, we try to imagine that on Earth some of the residents, humans, some are much more enlightened than in prior centuries, and others are a work in progress. Tuadon turned and walked back out to the balcony, resting his hand on the rail. Salmon walked over to join him, resting his arms on the railing as he absorbed the cityscape before them.
The update,
Salmon said, returning to normal volume,
is the most controversial part, aside from the politics, right? Some of your fandom is saying you've taken them to a level of technology in the game where, yes, it's not magical, but it won't be like the old game.
Salmon shifted his weight onto one arm as he twisted his body to look at Tuadon.
Like the communication devices you made up.
I read about some of the stuff exposed in your new law books put out last year. Well, I read a summary my team wrote for me. Salmon continued, brushing bits of his tightly coiled, long salt and pepper hair over his shoulder.
Cell phones that let humans talk at a distance, just like a telepathic stone in the real world. In all the earlier iterations, player characters couldn't talk with other characters unless they were right there with them.
Some people are saying you may as well have just added magic. The aficionados think it might ruin the immersion. Salmon laughed lightly as he finished, looking back over the city again. Tuadon let out a small sigh, letting the wind gently push strands of white hair from his face. He had grown terribly accustomed to these questions over the last few months. Closing his eyes a moment to think, he turned to face Salmon. We like to think we hit a balance spot with the new iteration. For instance, it would still take a human hours and hours to get from one continent to another. The limitations are different, but still there, said Tuadon, glancing over the city skyline again. If this is our conversation before the interview, I'm afraid I won't make it out of this office alive. Tuadon smiled, turning to rest his back against the balcony. Okay. Salmon laughed, hands raised in mock surrender. I will stop grilling you until the interview. He paused. Clearly, he was not quite finished.
One more thing, though. I know humans on Earth have multiple languages, and I know that it's only called Earth in one language. But for your players who don't just do tabletop gaming, the ones who go into the collective immersion trances and interact with the non-player characters, all they hear everyone speak is Common. How come the non-player characters all speak Horaith Common Tongue?
Tuadon chuckled at the almost stream of consciousness onslaught of new questions. So the players can understand them, said Tuadon simply. There are a few extremely devoted players who learn the constructed languages of Earth, but most are not going to pay coin to play a game if they have to learn or enchant themselves with knowledge of a fake language just to be able to understand what is going on. Salmon smiled.
Thank you for answering all that. I tend to come off intense, but we're just talking.
Salmon turned away from the balcony, beginning his walk back to the makeshift set for final sound check.
Save the formality for the interview.
I'll give you a little time for yourself. Come sit down when you're ready. Salmon departed the balcony and resumed his work with Thomas, making final adjustments before they assumed their positions for the live broadcast. Watching the two interact for a moment, Tuadon turned back to gaze out at the skyline of Okasela again. Letting his mind wander, Tuadon mused that if Salmon Ann was this difficult in a casual conversation, he almost dreaded how he would be in the interview. Both the political and ethical matters around the release of the new iteration were weighty enough. Add to that the less important but no less stressful tension in the fandom since the comments when the law books released last year for the upcoming 5i launch. Tuadon wondered if any of these changes should have ever been made to Earthgame to begin with. Perhaps the whole franchise should have been retired and a whole new game with a new backstory set up. But there was no time for second-guessing now. Leaving the balcony view behind, Tuadon entered his office again, now fully taken over by Selman, his assistant, and their equipment, and prepared for the interview. I don't know if I'd say he's overthinking it, Scully. 1, he has had a brand to run, and optics are a thing. 2, it's a tense time. People are having all kinds of conversations about how to have conversations, and the LGR Festival is real soon. The Lich, Ghost, and Revenant Festival next month, celebrating that community's contribution to Okasela. Dark Elf Culture Month was last month. The mechs and beast folk have various things. They're all very positive, Scully, but sometimes get a little bit more about image than substance. I'll get into that, yes. I'm not going to dangle something in front of you and not follow up. Sorry, I forgot you don't have full awareness of the present and past. Like I was saying, thoughts about social good are in the air, and for Tuadon, that means self-introspection. What do you mean I could introspect? Have I not? What have I been doing? Do you not care how the interview actually goes? Let me take you out of my pocket for this. Look you in the sockets. I do too have eyes. Don't you see the luminous spheres coming from under my helmet? Those count as eyes, buddy. Anyway, a few moments later, the Metastream equipment was primed and ready to go, with Thomas at the controls. With chairs neatly centered in the middle of Tuadon's spacious office, Tuadon and Selman sat across from each other with the chairs at about a 45-degree angle. Thomas began the countdown, and the equipment thrummed to life. Activating the vocamps clipped to Selman and Tuadon's shirts, Thomas motioned for Selman to begin the interview. Good evening, Okasela. And thanks to our immersion projection share affiliates, good evening to all our viewers around the continent, said Selman, offering a broad smile to the shard projection interface. I am here tonight at the office of Tuadon Apolloch, head of the Athens Creative Group, and unless you've been living under a rock, you know this company takes its name from a fictional location in its wildly popular Earth game role-playing series. Selman turned to Tuadon, offering a wide smile that looked better suited on the face of a drooling predator. So, Tuadon, in case anyone isn't familiar, the 5th iteration of Earth game, asked Selman. Tuadon returned Selman's smile with one as equally political. Thank you for stopping by, Selman. Tuadon fell into his practiced broadcasting habits and leaned towards Selman as if he were sharing a great secret. Well, Selman, our game is set on a fictional and magicless world called Earth, inhabited only by humans. Tuadon reached out his arm theatrically, indicating the audience watching the broadcast. Our players have been enjoying the game and its unique role-playing opportunities for about 70 years now, said Tuadon. Selman leaned into his chair, continuing the bit. So what makes your game different from, say, Warring States? Asked Selman, gesturing for Tuadon to respond. Tuadon smiled brightly again, nodding to the projector. Well, I know the team at Warring States, and it's a great game. I play it myself. He turned back to Selman. Now, in Earth Game, you can do all the things you can do in Warring States. Battles, spy missions, and that sort of thing. But with each iteration of the game, we increase how much lore is written in the history of Earth and its world building. And we move forward in time a little bit. Selman nodded as Tuadon spoke with the effortless charm of a seasoned interviewer. Tuadon continued. 5i is going to be set in Earth's 21st century. And there will still be settings in the game for conventional campaigns, but you'll be able to do more. Tuadon swept his arm outward with a dramatic flourish. You'll be able to play corporate campaigns, social and social media campaigns, political campaigns, as well as live deep as the characters you create, who may not be power players, but regular people. There are literally thousands of cities you can live in. You can roleplay as anyone you want. Tuadon finished, resting back into his chair. Keeping his broadcast veneer secured, Tuadon inwardly wondered. The interview was going like a fluff piece, with just enough meat in it. Your standard release junket. Tuadon wondered if Salmon had been told to do the interview that way, and if so, Tuadon could handle a few more minutes of this. And in fact, Five Eye has been redesigned with that in mind, has it not? Asked Salmon, his eyes starting to take on a hard glint.
I believe your users are great fans of these social campaigns, but they often play them out as proxies for issues in our real world. Yes? Asked Salmon. So much for fluff, Scully. Ah, there it is. The moment Tuadon dreaded had arrived. Salmon was attempting a gotcha moment for the world to see. Tuadon wasn't sure what Salmon was trying to accomplish, but Tuadon would be damned if he was going to make it easy. Taking a few thoughtful moments as he nodded dramatically for the projection, Tuadon calculated his response. Sometimes, said Tuadon. We are really excited for those who want it. We have kept the world without magic, of course, but we have upped the technology level radically from 5-Eye since 4-Eye, which was set in the Earth's 19th century. Tuadon let the moment breathe before continuing, casually gauging Salmon's response out of his peripheral vision. Salmon was nodding, but his eyes retained that harshness he saw earlier. He wasn't finished yet. Tuadon continued. For those who do like social campaigning and reflecting issues that are important to them in day-to-day life, this is going to make that easier. We've given them something like our media and culture, but it's still Earth. We now find humans struggling to be egalitarian and democratic in the 21st century more so than before, added Tuadon. Ah, so they haven't hit the nail on the head of freedom and equality for all yet. Sounds like a world I know, said Salmon, offering a knowing look to the projector. Salmon leaned back in his chair, motioning a casual thought experiment, though his eyes betrayed that the following exchange was anything but casual. Anyway, so, if I was a player and I wanted to play out, let's say, some of the tensions between elves and humans, as they are in other parts of the world that aren't as they are here, how would I do that if there are only humans? Asked Salmon, resting his hands on his lips as he leveled an intense glance back at Tuadon. Now fully engaged in this thinly veiled psychological combat, Tuadon remained casual. Excellent question, Salmon, said Tuadon, leveling the journalist with his own I see what you're doing glance. That is up to the player. On Earth, for example, people sometimes segment you by who you choose to love. And many members of the ethereal community often roleplay as a human from a sexual orientation minority group. But, Tuadon raised his hand for emphasis, you might not choose to play that way. You might identify as coming from a particular part of the world. Tuadon waited for Salmon's next volley, nakedly giving the journalist a studious stare. Ah, so the guild doesn't say who has to be who. Do the players ever disagree who gets to be who? Asked Salmon, curious and intrigued that Tuadon had not buckled yet. Tuadon retained his casual tone. Of course they do. The game has pink humans, and some people say that they're, light elves, like me, the privileged group. But some humans don't like that. They say that in a society where humans thrive, they can be who they want. Salmon used his hand to hide a smile. So far, Tuadon was taking this interview well. Glancing over to Thomas, he watched as his assistant silently begged him not to do what he was about to do. Looking back to Tuadon, he fixed his predatory glare on the elf. Let me ask now about your father. There was a version before the main release, I believe, that he created in school. It was a thought exercise about how a magicless and causal world would play out, said Selman, his previous congeniality fading slightly from his voice. Tuadon smiled, knowing where Selman was going with this. Tuadon guessed the journalist was hoping he was going to try and steer around it and flank him on the other side. But Tuadon was ready. He was going to aim his boat headlong into the storm. People thought he talked about his father as some old elf guy, and didn't own that Sotha Apolog was his father. But in Tuadon's internal world, Sotha really was just some old elf guy who was technically his father. Yes, said Tuadon. My father and his friends were all elven, light elves. They decided to populate the world with only humans. My father sadly believed humans were less adept magic users, as did many people in those days, said Tuadon with surprising frankness. Selman froze, not usually caught off guard in an interview. Selman found the prospect equal parts thrilling and annoying. Tuadon had taken Selman exactly where Selman had planned the interview to go. However, Selman had thought to drag him there slowly as he floundered to explain nuance and context. But the elf blurted it out, not trying to disown it. At that moment, Selman realized Tuadon's intellect was not to be underestimated. Before Selman could recover, Tuadon continued. Tuadon pumped his voice with the correct amount of somberness. You know, Selman, we thought about scrapping Earthgame. I drafted a fictional game called Entropy, set on a parallel Hraith, where the Great Entropy never ended, with an alternate history. The alpha players for Entropy, though, it didn't give them something intangible that Earthgame did. Like our city that has its issues. We still try to make our game work, with its problems. Finally regaining his verbal bearings, Selman nodded with equal somberness as Tuadon finished. Thank you for sharing that, Tuadon. I can see you have thought about these issues deeply. Realizing his perfect attack had been effortlessly parried, Selman eased the conversation into a new direction. And in a few weeks at the Gaming Guild convention, when you show off 5i, will you be showing how Earthgame can work despite its prior flaws? Asked Selman, prodding Tuadon's defenses. Yes. And with the help of the gaming community, we at Athens Guild and the 5i team hope to make Earthgame better. For all of us. Tuadon responded coolly, letting Selman know that it would take far more than that to shake him. The interview piece was part of a meta-broadcast of other items, which were only supposed to be a few minutes long. So, with Selman's initial venom expended, the broadcast continued. Tuadon and Selman's tone eased into something far more casual, with a bit of lighter chit-chat between the two, along with standard information reminders and dates of convention, and an obligatory sign-off by Selman. Thomas shut down the equipment once confirming they were no longer live and cried an audible sound of relief. Thomas adored Selman and respected him deeply, but being witness to a Selman interview usually felt like visiting a war zone. Retrieving the vocamp from Tuadon, Thomas offered the elf an awe-filled smile. You did very well, sir. Tuadon, still coming off the adrenaline high from the interview, gave him a slight look of confusion. Thank you. Selman chuckled, covering his mouth with his hand as he watched the exchange. After Thomas left to place the Metacast equipment back into their travel cases, he turned to Tuadon. You really believe all that, don't you? Asked Selman. I do, said Tuadon, offering Selman a guarded look. You're an interesting guy, said Selman, a genuine smile on his face. Tell you what. Would you be okay with me doing a follow-up piece in a few weeks at convention? See how this goes, said Selman. Depends. Are you constantly going to attempt to ambush me in every conversation?
Tuadon didn't bother hiding the defiance in his face. He wasn't offended completely, but he was not about to let Selman just walk all over him. Selman raised his hands in surrender.
I apologize for my brusqueness. I'm normally accustomed to interviewing individuals with less intellectually high standards than you. I underestimated you and your convictions, and I honestly apologize for that.
Tuadon met Selman's steady gaze and found no deception. Just the same intensity he always maintained. Bowing his head slightly, he responded, I accept. He paused before continuing. I'll be honest, I never had an interview quite as intense before.
But why do you want to interview me again at convention?
I don't think you need my permission for that, said Tuadon.
Well, no, but I've got to be honest. A dozen other media outlets are going to be covering the launch, and at least half will be writing about the social controversies.
Selman's eyes softened.
You fascinate me, and I'd like to get to know the guy behind it. The guy who just unfluffed his own product on a live broadcast.
Selman laughed. I am a family guy and pretty private, said Tuadon, crossing his arms across his chest instinctively.
Okay,
said Selman, pulling back on his bold eagerness.
I'll write 2 pieces on you. One on the launch at convention. That one I'll write what I write. Nothing personal on you, other than what you do and say there or put out on your media channels, and my take on it, said Selman.
And the other? Tuadon continued to study Selman for any hints of deceit.
The one on you. I will give you veto power on anything in it, including me never running the story. I swear to my invisible friends,
said Selman, holding up his hand in a mock oath. Maybe, said Tuadon. But I want to know the man who wants to write this. So to start, let's get a coffee tomorrow, or the day after if you're free, said Tuadon, carefully beginning to uncross his arms.
Fair enough, tomorrow will be fine.
With that, Selman bowed his head and rose from his chair. Looking over to Thomas, he saw his assistant was eagerly waiting to leave.
Until next time, Tuadon Appelock.
Selman bowed again and began to exit the room. As Selman left Tuadon's office, what?
Yes, Tuadon left his office too. He didn't sleep there, but we hung out with Tuadon before the interview.
I thought we'd hang out with Selman now.
Well, Scully, the fact that you say you don't like him is all the more reason for us to spend some time with him.
Struggling with various bags of equipment, Thomas scurried to catch up to Selman, readjusting the bags on his shoulders, and asked the reporter if he wanted to get a bite to eat.
Sorry, Thomas, not today. I have a few more errands to run before I head home.
Nodding sullenly, the two said their goodbyes and parted. In truth, Selman had nothing else scheduled that day. But the human wanted some time alone with his thoughts. Is Selman mad at Thomas?
No, he didn't want to get a bite to eat with anyone. It wasn't Thomas per se, Scully. Sometimes people need to be alone to think. The interview with Tuadon kept playing back in Selman's head. Selman wondered why a media guy like Tuadon seemed to actually care so much. But what did he care about? He saw some kind of complex in Tuadon, like the one he himself had. Albeit his own complex was sharper around the edges. The dark-skinned human buttoned up his long coat and decided to walk home. He hated walking, but hated getting on and off the transport, with what to him was an unnecessary process to just go one station down the line. Selman purposefully slowed his gait, masochistically wanting time to give himself a migraine thinking about the big picture. Selman believed, as most rational people did, that the world was magico-causal. There was something, though, about Earthgame that unsettled him. He was used to the idea in fantasy of a purely causal world, lacking the same problems his suffered from. Usually in fantasy there was some baddie fight, and once they were felled it was over.
It didn't quite occur to him why a fantasy world with realistic problems was so unsettling. He quickened his pace to the extent his slightly out-of-shape body would allow, as it was cold out. Selman reached the door to his building and cast the unlock spell coded to his aura. He entered automatically and waved for the immersion globe to go on. He lay down, still shot, on the couch. He would probably fall asleep this way. There came a time of night, above all else, he wanted to be still. The globe played a documentary which projected telepathically into his mind about nature and wildlife on other continents, even as he closed his eyes. Selman needed noise to sleep, content to chew on, or his mind would keep him up. Moving the thoughts around in his head, he felt he might now know what it was that bothered him about Earth having problems like the real world. It was the idea that, regardless of the universe one occupied, that some kind of inequality and some kind of essentialism was inherent to sentient beings. And in turn, this meant for the real world that no matter what iteration of the game of life, one would never be free of them. It was the price tag of existence, perhaps. You like Selman now. Well, of course he's not going to feel well waking up with all his clothes on, not having had anything to eat before bed.
I don't want to intervene yet, Scully.
I am not there yet, either physically or philosophically.
Okay, fine. For you.
You do care about people, Scully. You're a good guy under all that sass, I knew it. Wake up, Selman. At least change into your pajamas and sleep in your own bed. That couch is not good for your back, I say. Selman awoke, startled as if he'd been spoken to. He was unsure if it was a draught of air that had passed upon waking, an unpleasant dream unrecalled, or a shift in the blood chemistry that made his heart pump strangely. So thought Salman Ann as to why he woke up. And now he engaged in the most minimal preparations for bed possible before settling down for a final sleep.
I don't want to do that regularly, Scully.
Not till we're in Ocasella.